I'm not a person normally to make a thing of titles, but it does seem appropriate, as Kit just reminded me, that I should introduce myself. I'm the Henry R. Luce Director of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, and it's a real privilege for me to be able to welcome everybody to this event, which is the brainchild of Paul Needham and Kit Luce, as the real movers and shakers behind today's event, which is really terrific for us to be here and able to hear about these two new biographies. The master of ceremonies of the panel is Shelley Kagan, who was the first Henry R. Luce Professor of Social Thought and Ethics at Yale. And so we're all in the family here today, but nobody came to listen to me, so I am going to turn over the podium to President Levin. Welcome, everybody.
Well, it's great to have everyone here at Henry R. Luce Hall for this very special occasion. I'm delighted to see so many members of the Luce family here today in this hall, which they established through the Henry R. Luce Foundation in this hall that essentially the Luce family built. This building, in fact, in the spirit of the man that it's named for, has helped to engage Yale students and faculty with the world around them, which of course was what Henry R. Luce was all about. And it's enabled great scholarship in the fields of international and area studies. Many of Yale's international initiatives over the past 15 years that have brought this university global recognition have begun right here in this building. And I'm truly grateful to the Luce family and to the Henry Luce Foundation for their generosity to so many activities and programs at Yale over the years. This is a very special time for those who are interested in the life of Henry R. Luce, because the two scholars who we're privileged to have here with us today are both about to share with the world a more thorough examination of Henry Luce's life than has ever been available before. Both are working on biographies to be published, in one case, very soon. And as we know, Henry Luce was among the most powerful and imaginative communicators of the 20th century. He graduated from Yale in 1920. Like the organizer of today's event, Paul Needham, he was the editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News. He and his classmate, Britton Haddon, founded their first magazine, Time magazine, 3 years after graduation. Time was truly unlike any other publication available in 1923. In its first issues, subscribers learned that Joseph Cannon, the once all-powerful Speaker of the House, had retired, and they learned that there was a famine in Russia. Time was ambitious in the breadth of its global coverage and also distinctive from the beginning in its use of pithy and often amusing language. Haddon died at a very young age, but Luce pushed forward and ultimately built Time Incorporated, which became, as we know, a giant publishing empire. He founded Fortune and Life and Sports Illustrated, and he was once referred to in a rival publication, Business Week, as being as close to a lord of the press as America could possibly produce. These, of course, are the basic facts about Luce, but we are especially lucky that we have Alan Brinkley and Lance Morrow here today, who have each explored their lives in great detail and have forthcoming biographies that will surely shed new life on Henry Luce's life and on his influence on America and the world. Alan Brinkley is the Alan Nevins Professor of American History at Columbia, a very well-regarded American historian, and he also did a stint for 5 years as the provost of Columbia University, undoubtedly delaying the publication date of this great biography, but we're all looking forward to it, and the biography will be called The Publisher, Henry Luce and His American Century. Lance Morrow is the author of 8 books and was for many years an essayist and senior writer at Time, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work over the years, and he remains a contributor there. He won the National Magazine Award for Essay and Criticism, and he twice shared other National Magazine Awards. From 1996 to 2006, He was a university professor at Boston University, and his biography is still in progress. Our moderator, Shelley Kagan, as Ian told you, was, when he first came to Yale, was appointed as the Henry R. Luce Professor of Social Thought and Ethics, and today he occupies the Clark Professorship of Philosophy at Yale. I'm very glad that Shelley's taken on the burden of keeping our panelists and our audience on track in today's discussion. And once again, I welcome you all to Yale and to Henry R. Luce Hall for what should be a really interesting hour. Thank you. Shelley, it's all yours.
Our format's going to be fairly straightforward. I'm going to ask each of our two speakers to speak for about 10 minutes each. And then after that, I'll ask whether either of them has any quick reactions to the other person's initial presentation. And then once that's over, we'll open it up for questions or comments from the audience. So without any further ado, I'll first ask Alan Brinkley to speak.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here at Yale, and I want to thank several people, Paul Needham and Kit Luce, for organizing this event. Peter Luce is here, and who was a great help to me. And I thank, in absentia, Hank Luce, Henry Luce III, who unfortunately is no longer with us. My original title for this book was The Missions of Henry Luce, and that title was scotched by my publishers, but and probably rightly so. But I do think that it says something about the life of Henry Luce. He was, as I'm sure you all know, the son of a Presbyterian missionary in China. And much of his life was shaped by the culture of the missionary world that he grew up in. Luce was, as you've just heard, the co-founder of Time magazine, the longtime head of Time Incorporated. And I want to argue that he was in many ways a kind of revolutionary, an unlikely revolutionary, certainly. He was the son, as I say, of a missionary. He was the product of elite boarding schools. He was a skull and bonesman at Yale. He was an ardent Republican through most of his life. He was one of the wealthiest men in America and lived accordingly. He disliked most of the New Deal and loathed Franklin Roosevelt. He said after Roosevelt's death, "It is my duty to go on hating him." His famous 1941 essay in Life, The American Century, was a call to reshape the world on the American model. He was a passionate champion of America's least popular wars. If he had his way, the United States would have used both the Korean and the Vietnam conflicts to unleash Chiang Kai-shek and join him in overthrowing the communist regime in China. But what made Luce a revolutionary figure was not his politics or his religion or his missionary zeal. It was his success in creating a new era of communications that had an enormous impact on the culture of the 20th century. At the precocious age of 24, Luce and his brilliant classmate and friend and partner and rival, Britt Haddon, created the first news magazine, a word that they invented themselves. Time was something almost completely new, a concise summary of the news of the world, published weekly, marketed throughout the United States and later around the world. It wasn't to everyone's taste, with its deliberately idiosyncratic language and its sometimes arch opinions, but for the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of readers, most of whom had in the past received news only from provincial local papers, Time was among the first publications that made the news of the world available to people in all parts of the nation. Time became, in a way, a kind of glue, providing professional and other mostly middle-class people with a common, reliable, and concise guide to information that was now more important to them than ever before. Haddon died prematurely of a strep infection in 1929, a few days after his 31st birthday, but Luce moved on without missing a step. In the first months of the Great Depression, he launched the first truly serious business magazine in 1930, Fortune, which was a dazzlingly beautiful magazine, but also a magazine written by some of the most talented writers of his time. 6 years later, Luce launched the first issue of Life, perhaps the most popular magazine ever published in America. It wasn't the first picture magazine by any means, but it was by far the most creative and successful, and it offered a visual image of its time, revealing, as Luce wrote in his famous prospectus, the faces of the poor and the gestures of the proud, strange things, machines, armies, multitudes, shadows in the jungle and on the moon, things hidden behind walls and within rooms, things dangerous to come to. Luce launched other innovations as well. Time Marches On, the first newsreels that offered real documentary features. Won an Academy Award for its creativity, a somewhat rigged Academy Award, I have to admit, but nevertheless an Academy Award. There was a weekly national radio program drawn from Time, and in 1954, the first really serious sports magazine, Sports Illustrated, began publication. From the mid-1930s through the late 1950s, Time Incorporated was probably the largest news organization in the world, with bureaus on every continent and with reporters active in almost all nations. They claimed to reach over 20 million people every week and even more during World War II, which the Time Inc. magazines reported at least as intensely as any other organization. The company's great success was partly a result of shrewd management and lavish, but usually careful budgeting, but it was also a result of Luce himself, who had looked into the future and had seen an increasingly integrated nation and world that would, more than ever, need a vast amount of information and an efficient way of accessing it. He embraced that future, and he created the vehicles that served the needs of his own rapidly changing time. So I think I'll stop there and turn this over to Lance. And I want to say how pleased I am to share the table with Lance Morrow, who I think I've been reading most of my life. And
well, thank you very much. Is this thing on?
Yes.
It is. Oh, good. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful to be invited by Paul and Kit, and I'm very pleased to be sitting here with the author of a terrific book on Luce, the best one that's been done, in my view.
So far, anyway.
So far. I don't know whether he's got the advantage on me or I have the advantage on him, because I have the later word than he, but anyway, I know what he's said. He doesn't know what I'm saying. What amazes me is how controversial Henry Luce remains. There's a sort of a scissor curve. I was wondering today whether a person of 25 really is aware of who Henry Luce was. And yet, I was reading a review of the Economist reviewed Professor Brinkley's book, and it contained the following statement: Henry Luce was wrong about everything. That was the reviewer, not Brinkley talking. But when I graduated from Harvard in 1963, one of the speakers at the commencement went into a long sardonic riff on the words time and life. And the gist of this conceit was that after 4 years in the rarefied purity of Harvard, we were about to be cast out into the America that Luce made. And I was not only cast out, I was astonished 18 months later to find myself going to work for Luce's magazine. I never met him. He had retired just before I came. But my mother, who was an old lefty from the 30s and a New Deal and eventually an Adlai Stevenson Democrat, was so ashamed of my going to work for a Luce magazine that she would barely talk to me about it. And she hated Luce almost as much as she hated Richard Nixon, which was a very great deal. Robert Coover wrote a book about the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg called The Public Burning. And in The Public Burning, time is presented as the poet, quote, poet laureate. And Luce, and this is the unkindest cut for the son of a missionary, is presented as a kind of antichrist. He is everything that the bad America represents. There is, if you'll permit me for a moment, there's a motif that I found amusing, a motif of assassination or would-be assassination that runs through the whole Luce story. In the early 1930s, when James Agee was a young writer at Fortune magazine, sitting in his office high in the Chrysler Building in Manhattan, he would have at night fantasies of walking down the hall to Luce's office, pulling out a pistol, bracing it on Luce's desk, and shooting him. And in his fantasy, all the other writers and researchers would peek like liberated prisoners out of their offices and would cheer James Agee as he came out of the, having done this deed. I must say, having worked at Time for many, many years, I completely understand the impulse. There were times that one felt that on deadlines and so on. But in 1945, there was a Marine. Luce went over to China just after the end of the war, and there was a Marine who was disgruntled about not having been shipped home yet, and he blamed Henry Luce for the fact. And he obviously somewhat disturbed, but he aimed his rifle at the back of Luce's head, and only because a buddy talked him down, and out of shooting Luce did he. Pearl Buck, who was another Mish kid, but of an entirely different, her father was a completely different kind of missionary from Henry Winters Luce, the Reverend Henry Winters. So Pearl Buck did an absolutely scurrilous novel called God's Men, which was published in 1949, in which she portrayed Henry Luce. She loathed Henry Luce, and she portrayed him as a monster who ran a large, obviously it was Luce, and obviously the newspaper empire that this man ran was Time Inc. And it's a very bad novel, but it's an effort at the assassination of Luce. Basically, it presents him. It's sort of hysterical that repeatedly, practically every other page, she informs us that her title character, Luce, had very tiny hands that were covered with black hair. The Swanberg biography that appeared in 1972, W.A. Swanberg, who was a Norman Thomas socialist out of the mid-30s, out of the Minnesota Farm Democrat Labor Party, and whose real American hero was Norman Thomas. Swanberg took after Luce and wrote the most relentlessly hostile book about Luce that I've ever seen almost about anybody. And that became a kind of premature last word on Luce. I'm delighted that Professor Brinkley and that I am are returning to the subject, because for a long time the Swanberg verdict on Luce was fairly widely accepted as the verdict on Luce. There's something of an Istanbul effect with Henry Luce. Istanbul, if a person approaches Istanbul from the west, he is struck by the city's eastern characteristics. If you approach Istanbul from the east, you are struck by what a Western city it is. If you approach Henry Luce from the left, he seems an incredibly conservative and, to Swanberg, reactionary, crypto-Nazi kind of character. If you approach Henry Luce from the right, he may seem quite liberal, and indeed he was on many, many subjects. He was a man who had far less consistency than the Swanberg cartoon would have you to believe, and he was a man with a very open and independent mind. He had a very penetrating mind, a probing mind. People who worked for him were terrified by his, to be confronted by him, because he did not like people who agreed with him in a facile way, and he worked them very, very hard. I have a friend named Chris Porterfield, who was a Yale graduate, who told me a story about, he wound up being an assistant managing editor of Time, but he told me that when he was a young man starting out in 1961 as an intern at Time, he was on the Washington Bureau. The Washington Bureau was having a dinner for Harry Luce, who would come down to talk to the correspondents. Chris was very nervous about this because he didn't want to talk to Luce, but then he decided he couldn't possibly pay any attention to me. I'm the junior man on the staff. He doesn't know who I am. Luce walked in the room, looked around, saw Chris Porterfield, this kid, and brushed aside everybody else and went relentlessly to this guy and said, who are you? What's going on? Where are you from? Minneapolis. Oh, really? What's going on in Minneapolis? Come on, give me the what's. And Chris was totally at a loss, and he said, well, and it was June. It was late May or June, so the weather was warmer in Minneapolis. He said, well, people are going out to the banks of the Mississippi. Oh, are they really? What are they doing out there? They're having picnics. Really? Well, tell me more. And they will build little fires sometimes, and they'll play the ukulele. And he says, the ukulele, really? No kidding. And then John Steele, who was his bureau chief, was right over his shoulder, and Luce sort of out the corner of his mouth. You hear that, John? The ukulele. They're still playing the ukulele in Minneapolis. And what do they call this? They call it riverbanking. You hear that, John? Riverbanking. So John Hersey, who worked for Luce for a long time, or for a while anyway, the novelist John Hersey, wrote a sketch of him once in which he said the most attractive thing about Henry Luce, and I think this was absolutely true, was that he was relentlessly curious about absolutely everything. He was delighted by any fact, to learn any fact that he had not known before. And sometimes this seemed almost fetishistic in the way that there are famous stories around Time of the terror that he excited in bureau chiefs who would go and rehearse the route in from the airport to know what every building was, so that they would be able to answer. John O'Hara, the novelist John O'Hara, once said that O'Hara was extremely fortunate as a novelist to have the most exciting material in the world. That is to say, the development of the United States in the first half of the 20th century. Well, that was Henry Luce's material, and it was very, very rich material that O'Hara wrote novels. Luce published his magazines, and as Professor Brinkley said, it was a kind of glue. He gave Americans an image of themselves. Americans are an extremely self-conscious people, and they need to have an image of themselves. They need to know what they think of themselves. And it seems to me that an interesting point about Luce and his magazines was that 52 weeks a year, they gave to Americans a running picture of themselves. Luce's critics made much of the fact that Life magazine in the 50s, for example, seemed to emphasize too much the unity that this was a vision of America that his critics thought was artificially unified. There was too much, it was too pretty almost, or too middle class. In fact, Luce addressed a lot more than the middle class. The point was that the middle class was in a state of movement, a dynamic movement after the World War II, rather. The GI Bill, the whole meaning of Time Inc. in many cases had to do with the enormous changes that were happening in America. But Luce's vision of America was centripetal, not centrifugal. And his, I don't know if you remember, I'll shut up in a second, but Edward Hicks was in the early 19th century was a Puritan, or rather not a Puritan, a Quaker minister and a folk painter who, you may remember his paintings of the Peaceable Kingdom, in which the wolf flies down with the lamb, they're lovely, actually. He did 30 different versions of this. Well, if it's not too extravagant to say so, I believe that the Life magazine that his critics were criticizing was a sort of 20th century version of that centripetal vision of a certain unity in the American proposition. In the 60s, America became centrifugal rather than centripetal. And the 60s were the decline and fall. Well, Luce died in 67, just as the United States was descending irrevocably into Vietnam. The centrifugal voices were everywhere. In 66, Luce went to something called the Hunt Ball, which was the Life magazine's annual staff party. George Hunt was the managing editor of Life. Luce, for the first time, very uncharacteristically, spoke to the staff critically of an article that appeared in Life. It was by a guy named Barry Farrell, who was a staff writer, and the article had compared favorably Allen Ginsberg to Walt Whitman. This outraged Luce, and it was precisely the difference between the centripetal and the centrifugal. He said Whitman's vision of America was a centripetal, embracing vision, which he believed profoundly. Amazingly enough, Whitman believed that his poem could stop the Civil War from happening. It could prevent the Civil War because it was an embracing vision. Ginsberg, in Luce's perception, was divisive, centrifugal, negative. And it offended something very deep in Harry Luce, that his own magazine, Life, would favorably compare Allen Ginsberg to Walt Whitman. I'll stop there. I've talked too long.
Alan, do you have any reactions to anything that's been said so far?
Well, I don't disagree with anything that Lance has said. I maybe will return just for a moment to the Swanberg book, which you began with. And of course, that was the first book about Henry Luce that I ever read. I picked it up at the Strand in New York many years ago, long before I had any idea of writing a biography of Henry Luce myself. And I read it, and it was a used book, of course. And on the flyleaf, some probably undergraduate, had written on the flyleaf, a great hatchet job and 99% true. But I think Lance is exactly right that Swanberg, who was indeed a Norman Thomas socialist, and in fact wrote a biography of Norman Thomas. In fact, I sat at a table next to him in the New York Public Library when he was doing research there. His biography of Norman Thomas was as adoring as his biography of Henry Luce was as detesting. So I think Henry Luce does need to be reconsidered. There is a very good book, short, about Henry Luce by James Bauman. which was part of a series of short biographies that was published, maybe almost 20 years ago. But there's been very little else that I think really does justice to Luce, and so I hope that the two of us maybe will help remedy that.
I think the Bauman, if I may for just a second, the Bauman it's good, and it's a lot more temperate than the Swanberg book, but I still feel that Bauman, there are solecisms in Bauman that I find very strange. For example, he's a member of the Vietnam generation, and the Vietnam generation used the words hawk and dove with a particular specificity referring to the Vietnam period. Well, he uses hawk. He applies the word hawk to Henry Luce in the American Century editorial in early 1941 as if it were a negative or pejorative term, which seems to me to stand reality on its head and shake it upside down. To be a hawk in 1941 when Hitler has long since invaded Poland and has overrun Western Europe, and Western civilization is that close, and there's Lindbergh is running around the country giving isolationist speeches, and Kingman Brewster is one of the partners in the founding of America First. At that moment, to use the word hawk on Luce seems to me preposterous. So I quarrel with the Bauman thing. I admire some parts of it, but there's something loused up in the I don't know, the Luce makes people mad in an interesting way. And he made me mad when I went to work for Time in '65. I didn't like him much. I never met him, but I didn't like him much. But there's something that really angers people about Henry Luce, and all these years later, he remains somewhat a controversial figure.
Very good. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you, when I call on you, to please stand, and then I'll try to summarize the question briefly so that everybody can have heard it. So any questions at all? Yes.
My interest is in the relationship that a biographer gets to his subject over the course of their relationship. I'm thinking of the historian Joseph Ellis offhand, who, when he started to write his biography of Jefferson, he said, "I was a great admirer of Jefferson at the beginning of the biography, and my feelings to him changed somewhat over the course of our relationship." And of course, the biography he wrote before on John Adams, you could almost see the affection for Adams leaping off the page. What were your personal feelings to Henry Luce during your time with him, and did they change over the period of your relationship?
Thank you. Just to repeat the question, it was, in working on somebody's biography, one often changes one's emotional reaction to the person over the course of working on it. And so the question is, how did either of you find your feelings about Luce changing in the course of working on the book?
T.S. Matthews, who was an editor of Time for a while and was close to Luce for quite a while, once said something about Henry Luce. He said he's not a likable man, but there's something lovable about him. And I found myself understanding that. I must say that for me, although his manner, people who knew him found him. I was speaking the other day to a guy who was a top editor at Time, who knew Luce, and I said, "Well, what was he like?" And he said, "Well, he was I liked him because what you saw was what you got. But there was something uncouth about him. I said, "What? Really uncouth? That's a strong, odd word. It's well, blunt, kind of blunt, slightly ill-mannered." My theory was that that blunt manner was a way of that he dealt with the staff. He could dispense with a lot of amenities, and he could sort of get to the point. I also think that if you read Pilgrim's Progress, Bunyan's Christian is very rude in exactly the way that Henry Luce was said to be rude. If Mr. Worldly Wise Man tried to steer Christian off the straight path, he was very rude to him. He was very brusque and rude and said, don't. And when he was in Vanity Fair, of course, Harry Luce married the former managing editor of Vanity Fair, but when John Bunyan was when Christian was in Vanity Fair, he was quite rude to some people. But anyway, I found myself rather unexpectedly for myself liking Luce a lot more than I thought I would. I certainly am very much aware of his faults and so on, and he was, to say the least, astigmatic about certain things. But I found myself liking him and finding that I thought that others had really missed the point about him, that there was that he wasn't what he seemed, that there was something else going on, that the game you saw wasn't the real game, that there was something else. And that's where I am now. I think that an awful lot that has been written about him has simply missed the point of Henry Luce.
Alan.
Well, I started working on this book deliberately by reading not any of the books that had been published about him, although I had read one long before, but instead reading the letters that Luce wrote to his family beginning when he was about 10 years old, when he went to boarding school, first in China and then at Hotchkiss and then at Yale. And these letters are really an extraordinary chronicle of this young man's life. And he was a very interesting young man, and in many ways a very impressive and attractive young man. And I think that helped me get through the rest of his life, in which he wasn't always as attractive, but was always interesting. And so I have a number of friends who write biographies. David McCullough, for example, once told me that he started out to write a biography of Picasso and then discovered that he loathed Picasso and he couldn't write about him. I don't feel that way about writing. I can write about people I despise as easily as I can write about people I like. But I came to the end of this book feeling that Luce had many flaws, many things I disagreed with, but also many very attractive qualities, including, among other things, his very early commitment to racial justice, very rare in the 20s, when he began writing about, he and Britt Hadden both began writing contemptuously about lynching and the failure of outlawing it. As a Republican, he was in fact a kind of moderate to liberal Republican, and his great champions in the Republican Party were Wendell Willkie and Dwight Eisenhower, both of whom he liked because they were not part of the right wing of the Republican Party. And his son believes that in 1964 he voted for Johnson, although I don't think there's any absolute certainty about that. So I think Luce was a more complicated and more interesting person than some of the early characterizations of him have been. Certainly he could be a very difficult person to work for and work with, but as a biographer, I found him extraordinarily interesting from beginning to end.
Somebody else? Yes. Could you stand, please?
I think I heard the comment that Harry Luce made people very angry, very mad, and maybe still does. I'd like to know who is the prototype who still gets mad at Harry Luce, and presumably is it older generation or
So the question was, who is it that gets angry at the thought of Henry R. Luce? And before I turn it over, I'll just quick anecdote about my own story. So as you've been told, I was appointed the Henry R. Luce Professor of Social Thought and Ethics when I came to Yale. And I'm young enough to only know I was supposed to not like Luce. I didn't know what it was about him I was supposed to not like, but all right, so who is it that knows enough, and why?
Well, I think it's a legacy of. It goes back many, many years, and it's a legacy. Luce announced that he was for things that most of his critics were either suspicious of or hated. He was a Republican, a Christian, a capitalist, and a patriotic American. Republican, nah. Capitalist, patriotic American, last refuge of a scoundrel. And Christian, well, he's a missionaries sort of in bad odor, missionaries not so hot. So on four counts, there was something wrong. I would argue that a lot of people who got mad at Luce, in my mother's generation and so on, got mad at Luce partly because he was right about a lot of things, and they were embarrassed about it. My mother, to quote my sainted mother yet again, was when she was just a kid. I mean, mid-teenager, she joined the Communist Party, and then very quickly found out that about the Moscow trials and so on, and as every intelligent American communist did, and she quit almost immediately. Whereupon she was named an enemy of the people, but age of 16 or 17. But she was wrong, and people were wrong about Stalin. People were about Mao. It's possible to argue that Chiang Kai-shek was incompetent, or at least his people were corrupt and incompetent and so on. But Mao didn't prove to be, the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward did not prove to be quite as wonderful as in the 1972 issue of in September of 1972, the issue of the New Republic that reviewed the Swanberg book. Right after the review of the Swanberg book came a review of the latest issue of Mao Zedong's poetry, and it was the most embarrassingly fatuous article This was at the height of the Cultural Revolution, when Red Guards were dragging professors out of their offices and beating them, sometimes to death. And this incomparably fatuous article in the New Republic was talking about how wonderful it was to have a poet as the great helmsman and so on. And so there are a lot of people who were very wrong about a lot of things, who resented the fact that Luce was about a number of things quite right. But I think it's a legacy of all that stuff. Whether younger people feel this sort of animus, I just don't know. I mean, I don't know. I hope some of them remember who Luce was, but it's hard for me to judge that.
Alan?
Well, I think a lot of the dislike of Luce, primarily the dislike of public, but the dislike of Luce was after World War II, when he became a much more fervent Republican than he had been in the past, and especially during the Eisenhower years, the magazine, Time anyway, was really extraordinarily slanted towards Eisenhower, not just during campaigns, but during the entirety of his presidency. And that was partly because Eisenhower was the first and only president with whom Luce had a really strong social connection, or personal connection, somewhat with Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy, but primarily with Eisenhower. And I think that was, at least in my memory as a boy, in a house where both my parents read Time and Life. My mother, would spout with anger at times when she would read a Time magazine, even though she read it every week. And my father, who was a journalist and had a more detached view, read Time with some equanimity, but also read Newsweek and lots of other magazines, and never had that kind of anger. But I think it was a political anger more than anything else, a partisan anger. It'd be a little bit, although not nearly as intense as liberals looking at Fox News today, but not nearly so bad.
But they were angry. I mean, it wasn't as if he was supporting. He was supporting Eisenhower, a moderate. As you pointed out, it wasn't as if he was supporting Jenner and Welker and McCarthy and Capehart and people like that. I mean, as these things go, Eisenhower was pretty much middle of the road.
Except on China, and he embraced the most reactionary figures in the China lobby at various times. But on the whole, I think you're right that he was a moderate Republican through most of his life.
Yes.
So I'm curious. I actually teach here at Yale, but I teach Henry Luce's American Century essay to students here, and they often have a really hard time only based on that essay, and no, they for the most part don't actually know who he is. Although his name's on a lot of things here at Yale, and so the name is familiar, but the background is not necessarily familiar. So just judging from that essay, they have a very hard time placing Luce politically, and so I'm just curious if you two could speak about the American Century as an essay, what it meant in Luce's life, if you've discovered anything new, and then how we ought to be making sense of it today.
Well, I don't know how many people here have read The American Century, but I'm sure some of you have. I'm sure, Bev, you have. I think one thing you have to remember is that this was a piece of propaganda written in 1941 before America entered the war. And it was an effort to shock the American people into understanding the importance of America getting into the war. So a lot of what was in that essay was a very specific effort to change popular views at a moment, a very important transitional moment in the movement towards the war. But of course, in the essay, there is also a lot more than that. And it does present a vision of the world that I think Luce really believed in, that the United States represented a kind of democratic triumph in the world that could usefully and morally be transmitted to other nations all around the globe. And that's, I think, one of the things that people find so odd reading the American Century today, because that's not a view that at least most people in this room probably would find comfortable.
I agree with everything that Alan said about the context in which the American Century editorial was printed. By the way, Luce came to regret the actual title. I think he was a little sheepish because it had a triumphal or imperial note about it that he hadn't intended. Henry Wallace later responded by saying, "Oh no, that's nonsense. We need the century of the common man." And there was a certain amount of cant in what he had to say. But I think the context of trying to get Americans involved in a really desperate world situation explains why he published the editorial. I disagree with the idea that I don't really read that as an aggressively imperialist or sort of triumphal kind of American statement. I think that it's an extension of the missionary universalism in which Christ said, "Go ye therefore and teach all nations." Luce was perhaps before anything else an educator, and he believed in an evolution toward a phrase that he very frequently used was the kingdom of God. His father also very often mentioned the kingdom of God, and it was a progressive evolution toward something. And I think that he regarded the American, it is true, of course, that there was something quite provincial. I suppose you could call it imperial provincialism or provincial imperialism. There was something provincial about this idea, and there still is. There was in, the 21st century version of the same idea. But I don't quite read it as a triumphalist or any such thing. I read it as as his intentions as being somewhat more benign and also urgent in the context of what was happening in Europe and was about to happen in the Pacific.
Who's next? Yes.
Hi. I wonder if you could speak about Luce and Yale, perhaps how his time and experiences at Yale influenced his ambitions later. I guess you would see this in his letters, and then what he did for Yale after he graduated.
The question was if we could hear something more about Luce's time at Yale, how his experiences at Yale influenced him, and what his connections with Yale were after he graduated.
Well, I think one thing you have to think about when you think about Luce's time at Yale is how different it was from what it is today. It was at the very beginning of Yale's movement out of this very conservative, strict classical education, and at the very beginning of a sort of modern liberal arts curriculum, and not yet achieved when Luce was there. One of the things that characterized Luce in the early 20th century was this sense that, yes, it was fine to be at Yale and take classes and have an academic life, but the really important thing was to work for Yale in some way. And everybody who was ambitious at Yale had to make some kind of mark at Yale, being the editor of the Yale Daily News, or being the head of the literary magazine, or being an athlete, or most of all being in one of the secret societies, especially Skull and Bones, which was Luce's greatest ambition and one of the things he was most proud of all of his life. So Yale was, to him, one of the highlights of his life, because he felt that he had been a great success there, even though he had been enormously disappointed that Britt Haddon became the president of the Yale Daily News, and he had to settle for managing editor.
I have nothing to add to that.
Anybody else? Yes.
Can you speak of Luce's position on Hitler and the Jews?
The question was, please speak on Luce's position on Hitler and the Jews.
I'm trying to think of the exact sequence of. There was the Laird Goldsborough period in the 30s. Laird Goldsborough was this rather supercilious and slightly strange man who was his foreign editor, whom he finally cashiered. But during the mid 30s, Goldsborough was given to writing almost flippant things about Mussolini, for example, and about Germany too, I guess. Was that, yeah. And I would let Alan do that, because I'm searching my mind to try to pinpoint the answer, but
Well, Luce and only very glancingly Goldsborough never said anything approving about Hitler. But I wouldn't say that Hitler was a great center of Luce's world, and nor did Time devote enormous efforts to discredit Hitler until the war broke out. And I think Time dealt responsibly with the Holocaust, but I wouldn't say it was a great leader in introducing Americans to the Holocaust during the war. I don't think there's anything in Luce's relationship with the Third Reich that would be morally abhorrent, but neither would I say that he was a great champion of defending the Jews, and so that's
Well, there's a great deal of criticism, as you know, of Franklin Roosevelt's behavior in this regard. And as far as media were concerned, Edward R. Murrow, late in the 30s, was getting rockets from the CBS office in New York saying, you know, you guys are being unfair. You're not being fair and balanced in your coverage of the Third Reich. You should be fairer to Hitler. And this was a guy, I've forgotten the name of the guy in the New York office who sent this memo to Morrow, but Morrow was quite outraged, rightly outraged by it. Morrow and his boys, as they were called, were very, very rough on, rough, they were just telling the truth. And, but, I mean, you have to point out that there were an awful lot of people, including Franklin Roosevelt, who were pretty, and the New York Times, who were very slow on this. So I wouldn't blame Harry Luce necessarily on that point.
Anybody else? Yes.
I'm interested in Luce as the media mogul, and I was wondering if maybe there were some insights that he had about publishing in media that you might have come across in your research.
The question was the request to hear a bit more about Luce as media mogul, and I think what we're looking for are some practical suggestions about how to become one. Did either of you glean any business tips you'd like to pass along?
Luce spent the 20s, you know, it's well known that Britton Haddon more or less edited the magazine through the 20s. Indeed, until his death in 1929. Luce spent the 20s learning how to be a businessman. And I think it's one of the secrets of the longevity of one of the characteristics of his magazines was the duration of their success. It's remarkable. A lot of magazines, like McClure's magazine, for example, which was a sensation early in the century with a lot of muckraking articles, McClure's went up and down pretty quickly. The Saturday Evening Post went on for years and years, but Luce had a string of extraordinary successes, and one of the reasons for this was that he, I think, had spent so much time learning all through the 20s until Haddon's death to be a businessman. And he knew that business very, very well.
I think one of the things that would seem strange to people looking at media corporations today is how important to Luce it was to invest heavily in the quality of his magazines. And that was one of the consistent pieces of his life as a creator of magazines. He and the people around him believed that the best way to be successful is to spend a lot of money and create great quality, and you'll make more money that way than trying to do it on the cheap. I don't think there are many people who think that way right now, but I think it did work for Luce.
Ian.
Yeah, a question that follows up on these views about journalism and media and magazines in the context of what you were saying about.
Ian, could you stand up?
In the context of what you were saying about centrifugal and centrifugal forces, I was wondering if you had any sense that he realized that we were getting into a much more segmented media market. You know, the world today is, we've got, Fox News has got one audience and New York Times has got a different one, and much less, much more fragmented did he foresee that, and what would he have said about it? And what would you say about what he would have said about it?
The question was, did Luce foresee the fact that we were moving towards a much more segmented media market, and I suppose we'd want to say culture more generally? Did he foresee it? If so, what did he say about it, and what thoughts you might have about his thoughts?
Well, Luce retired in 1964, and the real sort of breakdown of social unity was only just beginning to occur. So I don't think you would find in Luce's time as head of Time Inc. a full realization of how fragmented American culture was becoming. By the time he died in 1967, he was much more aware of this and did speak about it, although not with the same impact. He even experimented with LSD at one point, and was very interested in the New Left, not particularly admiring, but very interested in it. But it's very hard to know where he would have gone had he lived longer into the 60s. Except that I don't think he would have been happy about the fragmentation of American life.
Yeah. Anything to add?
No, I think that's right. I think that he, one thing that strikes you about Luce is the neatness with which he was born and died. He was born in 1898 at exactly the moment the Spanish-American War began, and he died rather briskly in 1967 at exactly the moment when the United States sank irrevocably into Vietnam. And in between, from 1914 to 1945, was what Neil Ferguson called the War of the World, which was one enormous, so that the World War, so that there was a trajectory in Luce's life which was remarkably symmetrical in a funny way, and somehow what came after, the fragmentation and the diversity and so on, was outside the symmetry, in my mind, was outside the symmetry of his life. His life had a curious kind of completeness in that sense.
Let me ask a question that I've been wondering about. So, Luce is a moderate Republican, and to what extent can this be traced to his own family upbringing? I know nothing about his parents. Was he self-made in this way, or is this coming out of a larger family?
His parents were basically social gospel Christians who were very much. His father was very much involved in the student volunteer movement, which arose in the 1890s, and to evangelize the world in one generation, as they said. They were great admirers of Teddy Roosevelt's. But, I mean, Luce voted for Al Smith in 1928. He was never, almost all of Luce's critics have been to the left of him. I know so they have seen him as more conservative than in fact he was, with the exception, as Alan says, of China. But another point that I would make about all of Luce's life was spent in the presence not just of constant, incessant, accelerating change, but in the presence of constant and accelerating transformation. He lived there was a transformation in absolutely every respect. When he was a little kid, the empires, seriatim, fell. China, Tsarist Russia, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, eventually the British, all the empires gone, the fragmentation of China into a warlord states, World War I+II, the onset of Freud and Einstein and machine guns and nuclear weapons and one transformation, automobiles, airplanes, everything was in a state of great transformation. And this, I think, is one of the reasons that when Mao was closing in on taking over China, Luce had been in the presence of great transformation all of his life, and he didn't see why it necessarily should be accepted as a fait accompli that this enormous country of China would suddenly become Mao's, except for the fact of Hiroshima and the bomb, the presence of the bomb. And some people, including Luce and MacArthur and Richard Nixon at some point, started using the adjective tactical in front of nuclear weapons, so that there was some talk in that area of tactical nuclear weapons. But it was the nuclear weapons that had introduced such a radically new element into the calculations that I think Luce's position on China was comprehensible in light of the entire context of the transformation that he had seen through the entire 20th century.
Any last thought?